You were taught to believe in a sequence. Start at the bottom. Learn the basics, take the small tasks, become useful, rise. It was never supposed to be glamorous. It was supposed to be real. That was the comfort. Not that the climb would be easy, but that the climb would exist. The lower rung was never just lower status. It was proof that you were inside the machine. Proof that the system could still convert a beginner into someone heavier. You could tolerate being overlooked, underpaid, underestimated, as long as the structure still allowed transformation. That was the promise. Not success. Not speed. Not prestige. Transformation. The bottom was where awkwardness turned into instinct. Where repetition turned into judgment. Where proximity to real work slowly changed the person doing it. You were told that if you stayed close enough to reality, reality would eventually leave marks on you. But what happens when the story survives? After the beginning is gone? What happens when the ladder is still worshipped? After the first reachable rung has already been removed? That story survived because every institution repeated it. School, degree, internship, first job, experience, seniority. The sequence became so normal that people stopped seeing it as a structure at all. It felt like reality itself. Parents repeated it. Teachers repeated it. Managers repeated it. Even disappointment made sense inside that model. A bad year did not destroy the ladder. It only slowed you down on it. A weak start did not erase the path. It only delayed your movement through it. That is why the illusion lasted. To believe in the ladder, you never had to see the top. You only had to believe the first rung was still there. That belief made sacrifice feel rational. It made delayed reward feel moral. It made low-status work feel like initiation instead of insult. The culture did not just teach ambition. It taught sequence. It taught people to endure uncertainty because uncertainty still seemed connected to progression. And that is the part people are still carrying now. The emotional loyalty to a structure whose beginning is no longer stable. And from a distance, it still looks stable. The offices are still there. The titles are still there. The internships are still there. The job listings are still there. The language of opportunity is still there. Everything ceremonial remains intact. Professional life still performs itself in the old grammar. Growth, development, exposure, pathway, potential. So the surface keeps telling the same story. And most people trust surfaces that still know their lines. That is the trap. A system does not need to collapse visibly to stop doing what it once did. Sometimes the signs survive first, then the structure dies behind them. Sometimes the doorway remains, after passage has already narrowed into theater. The listing exists. The badge exists. The recruiting language exists. But the invisible part, the part that used to turn entry into formation, has started thinning underneath the performance. Nothing looks dramatic enough to trigger alarm. That is exactly why the deletion spread so quietly. The architecture is still announced, but the initiation path underneath it is no longer wide enough to trust. The first real deletion happened where almost nobody was looking. At the bottom. In the work people used to dismiss as trivial. The repetitive tasks. The first pass tasks. The cleanup tasks. The tasks nobody respected. Because they thought the value was only in the output. It wasn't. The deeper value was proximity. Those roles placed new people near the machinery, near the rhythm, near the errors, near the pressure, near the small judgments that never appear in textbooks. That layer looked inefficient from above. So it became the easiest layer to remove. And now many of those beginner tasks are no longer done by beginners at all. Not because they vanished, because they became absorbable. By software, by systems, by redesigned workflows, by tools that can execute fragments without needing a human novice attached to them. The profession is still visible. What is disappearing is the place where a beginner used to touch it first. The first living contact, the first friction, the first exposure that used to make the work real. What disappeared first was not the profession. It was beginner access to its interior. This is the part people keep naming too weakly. They call it efficiency, automation, optimization, cost discipline. All true. And still too small. Because the system is not just removing labor. It is removing apprenticeship. It is cutting away the layer where people used to become legible to the work. A beginner was never valuable because they were already good. A beginner was valuable because they could survive small pieces of reality long enough for reality to start leaving marks on them. That is what the bottom used to do. It exposed you in fragments. Enough ambiguity to sharpen you, enough repetition to change you, enough error to build judgment without destroying you. That bridge is thinning, and the system barely says so out loud. It still wants people with instinct, still wants people with context, still wants people who can sense what does not fit. It just keeps shrinking the environments that used to produce them. That is the hidden asymmetry. The system still depends on mature judgment, while quietly dismantling the conditions that once made mature judgment possible. And then it calls the result progress. Why is this so hard to name? Because the ritual survived. The institution still performs seriousness. Universities still graduate people. Companies still recruit. Platforms still list entry-level roles. Career language still sounds intact. And human beings are deeply obedient to ritual. If the script survives, we assume the function survives. If the badge survives, we assume entry survives. If the title survives, we assume formation survives. But ritual can outlive reality for a very long time. That is why people keep choosing the wrong explanation. They say competition is higher. They say standards are rising. They say young people need resilience. Maybe. But that still describes this as a harsher version of the old path. And that is not quite right. This is not the same ladder with more friction. This is a system that still points upward, after quietly reducing the human infrastructure that once let someone begin. The ceremony stayed. The conversion process did not. And when conversion disappears while ceremony remains, structural loss becomes very easy to misread as personal weakness. That confusion is not accidental. It is one of the ways the myth protects itself. The old structure was a pyramid. A wide base, a narrowing middle, a small upper tier. Difficulty was expected near the top. What people did not expect was invisibility at the bottom. Now the shape is changing. Not a pyramid, a diamond. The experienced core remains. The strategic layers remain. The visible competence remains. What thins out is beginner absorption. Less room for trial. Less tolerance for slow usefulness. Less space for someone to become real gradually. And this is where the system becomes deceptive. The upper layers can remain impressive for years. From a distance, everything still looks healthy. There are still seniors, still leaders, still experts. But that visibility hides the deeper fracture. A profession can preserve its current seniors, while no longer reliably producing future ones. That is not continuity. That is inheritance wearing the mask of renewal. Seniority begins to look earned from far away, and inherited from up close. The shape remains legible. The reproduction mechanism underneath it does not. And that is how a professional class slowly hardens into a caste without needing to say so out loud. So newcomers arrive carrying something that looks complete. A degree, a portfolio, a polished vocabulary, a surface of readiness. And almost immediately, they hit something they cannot name. They are asked for judgment before they have lived inside enough reality to form it. They are expected to sound experienced before they have been allowed to accumulate the kind of experience that changes the body. That is the cruelty of this stage. You can look prepared, and still feel structurally unformed. You know the language, but not the weight. You know the concepts, but not the texture. You know what the profession says about itself, but not what it does when reality stops behaving cleanly. So people compensate. They over-prepare, over-perform, over-explain, imitate confidence, borrow tone, borrow polish, borrow certainty. But polish is not context. And eventually the person feels the gap in private, even while appearing qualified in public. The resume looks coherent. The interior still feels unfinished. That is where silent panic begins. Not because the person is empty, but because the formation layer that should have deepened them was never allowed to fully happen. That gap creates a new psychological condition. Not beginnerhood. Something colder. Perpetual juniorhood. You are not simply early. You are adjacent. Adjacent to the role. Adjacent to the institution. Adjacent to the language of advancement. Adjacent to the identity you were told you were entering. But never fully inside the process that used to make insiders. That is why the emotional texture is so strange. You do not feel like someone climbing slowly. You feel like someone hovering near initiation that never starts. Evaluated before being formed. Measured before being trusted. Expected before being trained. And because the old story still dominates social language, most people interpret that feeling the wrong way. They call it insecurity, imposter syndrome, bad timing, personal weakness. But some forms of self-doubt are structural. Sometimes the reason you cannot feel your footing is that the floor where people used to learn balance has already been taken out from under the profession. You are close enough to be judged, but not close enough to be properly formed. That is not merely frustration. It is exclusion without a clean moment of rejection. And the deepest loss is not only personal. It is institutional, civilizational inside the profession itself. Because if fewer people are being formed properly, fewer future seniors are being formed properly too. That does not show up all at once. For a while, institutions can keep living off old depth, old judgment, old instincts, old context, old people who were shaped before the lower layer thinned out. That is why the present can still look competent. The system can consume yesterday's formation for a long time, but it cannot do that forever. No profession renews itself through documents alone, or titles, or repositories, or best practices. It renews itself through repeated initiation, through the slow transfer of tacit pattern recognition from environment to person. When that process weakens, the profession does not die immediately. It becomes finite. It keeps the appearance of expertise in the present, while reducing the conditions that allow expertise to be born again later. That is a much colder kind of decline, not collapse. Sterility. A system can look productive for years, while quietly losing the ability to reproduce the kind of people it still depends on. So this is not just a tight market, not just a rough cycle, not just more competition, not just young people needing to adapt faster. Those explanations are too polite. What is disappearing is apprenticeship. The passage itself. The zone where someone once moved from outsider to practitioner, from supervised repetition to internal judgment, from formal eligibility to actual weight. That passage was slow, messy, sometimes inefficient. But it did something the optimized system still depends on, while increasingly refusing to fund it. It turned exposure into instinct, participation into belonging, labor into inheritance. And once that passage thins out, the old story of advancement becomes dangerous, because the latter still exists in language, after its lower structure has already been removed in practice. This is why so many people keep blaming themselves with such precision. They are using an old map to explain a changed terrain. But the terrain is different now. This is not the old ladder with more pressure. It is a structure that still speaks the morality of climbing, after deleting the conditions that once made climbing humanly possible. The missing rung is no longer symbolic. It is operational. And that leaves behind a very specific kind of aftermath. The system still tells you to start somewhere. Still tells you to be patient. Still tells you to earn your place. Still tells you the path exists for those willing to take it seriously. But something essential has already been removed. You were not denied the top first. You were denied the beginning. Not through open exclusion. Something quieter than that. By preserving the myth of the ladder, after deleting the lower rungs where people once learned how to stand on it. That is why the disorientation runs so deep. Everything still points upward, but almost nothing begins where it used to begin. So you keep hearing the command to climb, inside a structure that removed the first reachable rung before you arrived. Not broken. Not paused. Removed. The system still speaks as if failure to rise is personal. After redesigning the world so fewer beginners can become heavy enough to rise at all. You were told to climb. But the colder truth is this. The The system did not block your rise. It deleted your beginning.